The sun was a merciless hammer on the anvil of the desert. It beat down on the cracked earth, on the skeletal remains of saguaros that reached for the sky like withered arms in prayer, and on the steel rails that cut a dead straight line through the shimmering heat. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless chugging of the locomotive, a sound that felt like the world's own tired heartbeat, and beneath that, another, more frantic rhythm, the desperate, ragged panting of a girl running for her life. Ellie's lungs burned with every gasp of superheated air. The small cloth satchel, holding everything she owned in the world, banged against her hip with a dull, bruising cadence. Her simple cotton dress, already worn thin from too many washings, was torn at the hem and smudged with the red dust of the territory. Sweat traced clean paths through the grime on her face, and her eyes, wide and the color of a startled fawn, were fixed on the last car of the slow-climbing freight train. It was a cattle car, its sides slatted and its door gaping open like a dark, promising mouth. She didn't dare look back. She didn't need to. She could feel them, the way a rabbit feels the shadow of a hawk. The sound of their pursuit had been swallowed by the vastness of the desert and the noise of the train. But their presence was a cold knot in her stomach. They were men who moved with a purpose that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with ownership, and she was what they had come to claim. Her legs screamed, muscles twisting in protest. The ground was uneven, a treacherous mix of sand and sharp-edged rock that threatened to turn her ankle with every stride. The train seemed to mock her, its speed deceptively casual, always just a little faster than her failing strength. For a terrifying moment, she thought she wouldn't make it. The dark opening of the car would slide away, leaving her to the sun and to them. The thought sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her, a final, primal surge of will. With a cry that was more air than sound, she lunged. Her fingers, raw and scraped, caught the edge of the wooden floor. Splinters dug into her palm, but she held on, her body swinging sickeningly against the side of the car. The iron wheels screeched on the track just inches from her dangling feet, a sound of grinding, final death. She kicked, found a purchase for her worn-out boot, and hauled herself upward. She didn't land so much as collapse, tumbling onto the rough floorboards in a heap of tangled limbs and sobbing breaths. For a long minute, she just lay there, the floor vibrating beneath her cheek, the smell of old hay, manure, and dry wood filling her senses. The world was a blur of motion and the deafening clatter of the wheels. She had made it. The first part was done. Slowly, shakily, she pushed herself up, crawling away from the open door and into the deeper shadows of the car. That's when she saw him. The car was not empty. In the far corner, sitting on a bale of straw with an air of such profound stillness he might have been carved from the landscape itself, was a man. He was tall, even sitting down, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of a heavy, dusty wool coat. The coat was a strange thing to see in this suffocating heat, a garment meant for mountain winters or the biting winds of the northern plains. It was the color of dust and faded twilight, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. His hat, a battered felt thing with a sweat-stained brim, was pulled low, casting his face in deep shadow. All she could see of him was a square jaw darkened with a day's worth of stubble and a mouth set in a firm, unreadable line. His hands, gloved in worn leather, rested on his knees. They were large, capable-looking hands, and they were perfectly still. He wasn't looking at her, not directly. But she knew he had seen everything: her desperate run, her clumsy scramble into the car, her current state of disheveled terror. He had seen it all and had not moved a muscle. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Ellie's exhaustion. A lone man in an empty boxcar was a danger as real as the men she was fleeing. He could be anyone: a drifter, a bounty hunter, an outlaw. He could be worse than the devil she knew. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her mind racing. Should she risk the fall, the rocks, the chance that her pursuers were still close enough to see? But the train was picking up speed now, the landscape outside blurring into a monotonous ribbon of ochre and gray. There was no going back. There was only forward, into this shadowed car with this silent, imposing stranger. She stayed huddled near the door, making herself as small as possible, her gaze darting between the man and the receding landscape. Minutes stretched into an eternity, measured only by the clack, clack, clack of the wheels on the rails. The man did not move. He did not speak. He seemed to be a part of the train itself, a silent passenger on a journey with no clear destination. The silence was unnerving. It was heavier than any threat, filled with 1,000 unspoken possibilities, most of them terrifying. Then she heard it, faintly at first, over the noise of the train, but growing louder, the sound of heavy boots on the roof of the car behind them. A thud, then another. They were on the train. Panic seized her, a blind, suffocating wave that threatened to drown her. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The car was a cage, and they were coming. Her eyes, wide with a fresh, raw terror, flew to the man in the corner. He was her only hope, however slim, however dangerous. She crawled toward him, the rough floorboards scraping her knees through the thin fabric of her dress. She moved not like a woman, but like a wounded animal seeking shelter from a storm. She stopped a few feet from his dusty boots, her body trembling uncontrollably. He still hadn't looked at her, his gaze seemingly fixed on some point in the empty space before him. But his stillness was different now. It was not the stillness of rest, but of listening, of waiting. Her voice, when it came, was a thread of sound, barely audible over the din. It was a prayer whispered into the void. "Sir!" He gave no sign he had heard. The shadows under his hat brim remained impenetrable. She swallowed, the sound loud in her own ears, and tried again, forcing the words past the lump of terror in her throat. "Sir, may I slip under your coat?" It was a desperate, nonsensical plea, an absurd request to a stranger who might kill her as soon as look at her. She expected to be ignored, or laughed at, or worse. She expected anything but what happened next. The man said nothing. His gaze did not shift. His expression did not change. But slowly, with a deliberate, unhurried motion, his right hand moved. He took hold of the heavy wool flap of his greatcoat and lifted it, creating a dark, triangular cave of shadow beside his body. It was an invitation without words, a gesture that held no judgment, no curiosity, no pity. It was a simple, profound, and utterly unexpected act. For a heartbeat, Ellie hesitated, staring at the offered darkness. It was a choice between the known terror that was coming for her and the unknown terror of this silent man. She chose the unknown. Scrabbling forward the last few feet, she ducked her head and squeezed into the space he had made. The heavy coat fell around her, instantly plunging her into a world of near-total darkness and muffled sound. The roar of the train became a distant rumble. The blinding glare of the desert sun was gone. She was cocooned. The air was thick with the scent of dust, worn leather, cold iron, and something else, something clean and distant, like pine needles after a rain. It was the scent of the man himself. She pressed herself against his side, trying to take up as little space as possible. Every muscle in her body tensed. She could feel the solid warmth of his leg and torso through the layers of his clothing, a steady, grounding heat in her cold panic. Her own heart was a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She was sure he could feel it, the frantic, terrified beat of her life. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps on the roof were closer now, directly overhead. Then came the sound of someone dropping onto the coupling between the cars, followed by the scrape of a boot on the floor of their car, just inside the open door. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in the rough fabric of the man's coat. A shudder racked her small frame, a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. She felt a slight shift beside her, the man's body adjusting, his arm settling more firmly over the coat that concealed her. It wasn't a comforting embrace. It was a practical, weighty presence, like a rock being settled into place to block a door. She was hidden, for now, hidden in the darkness, under the silent protection of a stranger's coat, while the monsters she had fled from stepped into the light, and in that small, warm space, with her heart thundering in her ears, she could only wait and pray that the silence of the man beside her was a shield, and not a trap. The first boot that landed in the boxcar did so with a heavy, deliberate thud that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into Ellie's bones, hidden in her cocoon of wool and shadow. She flinched, a small, convulsive movement she instantly tried to suppress. A second boot followed, then a third pair, the sounds distinct and menacing. The light from the open doorway was momentarily blocked by 3 silhouettes, large and jagged against the brutal afternoon sun. Ellie dared not move, dared not even breathe. She could hear them now, their voices low and coarse, a gravelly counterpoint to the rhythmic clatter of the train. "Nothing in here but dust and stink," one of them grumbled. His name was Jed, a man whose patience was as thin as his lips. "She's on this train. Jed, saw her jump it myself," a second voice answered. This was Barlow, the leader. His tone was colder, more certain, carrying a quiet authority that promised violence without the need for shouting. "Check the corners. She's small, could be tucked in anywhere." Beneath the coat, the world was suffocating. The heat was immense, and the scent of the man beside her, that strange mix of pine, leather, and cold dust, was overwhelming. Ellie could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. It was a calm, powerful rhythm, utterly at odds with the frantic terror that was making her own heart feel as if it would burst through her ribs. She pressed her face deeper into the rough fabric, praying for invisibility, for a sudden act of God that would make the train derail or the sky fall. The footsteps moved around the car. A bale of hay was kicked over with a curse. Ellie heard them moving closer to their corner. Her breath hitched. A tiny, wretched sound she was sure they must have heard. She felt the muscles in the man's leg tense, a subtle hardening that was the only outward sign he was aware of the approaching danger. "Well, now, what have we here?" Barlow's voice was closer, laced with a cruel amusement. "Looks like we ain't entirely alone. Boys." Ellie squeezed her eyes shut so tightly she saw bursts of color against the blackness. This was it. They had found him, and soon they would find her. "Mister," Barlow said, his voice dropping the pretense of humor, "we're looking for something. A piece of property that ran off. A young girl. You seen her?" The man beside her, Silas Boone, remained perfectly still, perfectly silent. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was more defiant than any shouted denial. Ellie could feel it, an unbreachable wall of quiet will. Jed's impatience finally snapped. "He ain't talking. Barlow, maybe he's deaf. Or maybe he just needs persuading." The sound of a boot scuffing the floor, taking a step closer. From her hiding place, Ellie could risk nothing, see nothing. Her world was the pounding of her own blood and the unyielding stillness of the man beside her. She could only listen as the tense drama played out. "Hold on, Jed," Barlow cautioned, though his own voice was tight. There was something about the silent figure in the corner that gave him pause. Silas had not moved, had not so much as tilted his head, but Barlow, a man who had survived by reading other men, could feel the danger radiating from him. It wasn't the coiled energy of a gunslinger waiting for a fight. It was something colder, deeper. It was the absolute indifference of a boulder on a mountainside. It would not move for you, and if you tried to move it, you would likely be crushed. Slowly, Silas lifted his head. Ellie felt the movement, the slight shift of his body. The shadow of his hat brim receded, and though she could not see it, she knew his face was now visible to the men. She could imagine his eyes, what they must look like. There was a moment of absolute silence in the car. where even the train's clamor seemed to fade away. "Damn, the third man, Pike," muttered under his breath. It was a sound of unease, maybe even recognition. Barlow's voice, when he spoke again, had lost its swagger. "Look, friend, we don't want no trouble. The girl belongs to a man back in Dusty Creek. Important man. We're just here to collect what's his." Silas still said nothing, but his gaze must have been enough. It was a weapon in its own right, a silent dismissal that stripped them of their menace and left them feeling exposed and foolish. They were predators who had stumbled into the den of something far older and more dangerous than themselves. Jed, however, was a creature of pride and impulse. Being unnerved only made him angrier. "I've had enough of this," he snarled, and Ellie heard the distinct, metallic scrape of a gun being pulled from a holster. "You're gonna tell us where she is, or by God, I'll—" He never finished the sentence. The world exploded into motion. In one fluid, impossibly fast movement, a hand shot out from under the coat and clamped around Ellie's wrist. It wasn't a gentle grasp. It was hard as banded steel, a grip that promised she would not be left behind. She felt herself being hauled forward, out of her dark sanctuary. A voice, the first she had heard from him, cut through the noise. It was low, raspy, and held no trace of panic. "Hold tight." That was all he said. 2 words, an order, not a request. He was on his feet, pulling her with him, using his body to shield hers from the 3 stunned men. For a split second, Ellie saw them, their faces a mask of shock and dawning fury. Jed's gun only halfway raised. Then Silas pivoted, and they were at the open door of the boxcar. The desert rushed past them in a blur of red and brown. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face. The noise was a physical blow. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he meant to throw her out, but he held fast to her wrist, his other hand finding her waist, pulling her tight against his side. Then he jumped. There was no thought, no time to scream. There was only the lurch of leaving the solid floor behind and the terrifying emptiness of the air beneath them. The world became a violent, tumbling blur of blue sky and red earth. They hit the embankment beside the tracks not as 2 people, but as one. Silas taking the brunt of the impact with his broad back and shoulder. The landing was a brutal, bone-jarring punctuation mark to their flight. The air was knocked from Ellie's lungs in a pained gasp. They rolled, over and over, down the sandy slope, a tangle of limbs and flying dust. Thorns and sharp rocks tore at her dress and scraped her skin. But Silas's grip never loosened. He held her to him, a human shield against the unforgiving ground. They came to a stop in a cloud of red dust at the bottom of the gully, hidden from the view of the track. For a moment, all Ellie could do was lie there, dazed, every part of her aching. The train roared past above them, its sound already beginning to fade, a mechanical beast continuing on its journey without them. Shouts, faint and angry, drifted down from the boxcar, but they were quickly lost to the distance. Her protector was already moving. He released her and pushed himself to his knees, his head cocked, listening. A thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his cheekbone, tracing a path through the grime, but he seemed not to notice it. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the area with a sharp, predatory focus. "Up," he said, the single word a command. Ellie's body screamed in protest, but the urgency in his voice was undeniable. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling, her legs feeling like jelly. He grabbed her arm, not unkindly this time, but firmly, and pulled her along. They ran, not toward the open desert, but toward a jagged scar in the landscape, a narrow canyon carved by 1,000,000 years of flash floods. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose scree and ankle-twisting rocks. Silas moved through it with a long, ground-eating stride, his familiarity with such terrain obvious. Ellie struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. Her simple shoes were no match for the terrain, and she felt a sharp pain in her ankle, But she bit her lip and forced herself to keep going. To stop was to die. She didn't understand. Why? Why had he done this? He didn't know her. He had no stake in her fate. He could have given her up, or simply ignored the entire situation, and his own life would have remained untroubled. Instead, he had thrown himself from a moving train and into a fight that wasn't his, all for a girl whose name he didn't even know. The question hammered at her, a frantic counter-rhythm to her pounding feet. Why? There was no time for answers. They plunged deeper into the winding stone corridor of the canyon. The rock walls rose high on either side, offering shade from the relentless sun and, more importantly, cover. After a few hundred yards, Silas pulled her to a halt behind a massive boulder. "Stay here. Don't move," he ordered, his eyes never ceasing their scan of the canyon rim above them. Before she could respond, he was gone, moving with a silent swiftness that was startling in a man his size. He returned a minute later, his hands full of dried grass and brittle twigs he had gathered from a sheltered crevice. He knelt, pulling a small leather pouch from his pocket. With a practiced economy of motion, he struck a shard of flint against steel, sending a shower of sparks into the tinder. The spark caught, a tiny orange eye in the dry material. He blew on it gently, expertly, coaxing it to life. A thin wisp of smoke appeared. Then another. He added more grass, and a plume of thick, acrid smoke began to climb into the still air, clinging to the canyon walls before drifting back toward the direction of the tracks. A false trail, a sign of a campfire, a distraction to pull their pursuers in the wrong direction while they escaped in another. He stamped out the small flame, leaving only the smoldering, smoking pile. He glanced back at Ellie. His expression was impossible to read, a mask of dust and grim determination. He saw her scraped hands, her torn dress, the terror that still lingered in her wide eyes. For the barest fraction of a second, something flickered in his own gaze, something that might have been pity, or perhaps just a weary understanding of the world's harshness. Then it was gone. He gestured with his head, deeper into the canyon. It was time to move again. Ellie pushed herself away from the rock, her whole body an orchestra of aches and pains. She looked at this silent stranger, this man who had inexplicably appointed himself her guardian. He was a mystery wrapped in dust and silence, a violent solution to a violent problem. She was no safer now than she had been an hour ago. She had simply traded one set of dangers for another. The desert's raw indifference for this man's unknowable intentions. But in this brutal, unforgiving land, he was also the only reason she was still breathing. And so, when he moved, she followed. She followed him as if there was no other path on earth left for her to walk. The trek that followed was a blur of exhaustion and pain. The sun, their enemy in the open desert, became a fleeting ally in the deep canyons, its light only reaching the stone floor for a few hours in the middle of the day. Silas moved with a relentless, steady pace, never seeming to tire. He read the landscape as if it were a book he knew by heart, choosing paths that were sheltered from view and offered the surest footing. He never spoke, save for a rare, one-word command, water. Rest when he deemed it necessary. Ellie followed, a ghost in his wake. Her body was a single, throbbing ache. Her scraped hand stung. Her ankle was a knot of fire, and the muscles in her legs had turned to lead more than once. She stumbled, her vision swimming, and each time, before she could fall, his hand was there, closing around her upper arm, steadying her with an impersonal strength before releasing her and moving on. He offered no words of comfort, no reassurances. He simply kept her on her feet and kept her moving forward. She survived those hours by detaching from herself, by focusing on the simple, mechanical act of placing one foot in front of the other. His dusty boots were her horizon, the steady rhythm of his stride her only metronome. The question of why he was helping her had been burned away by the sheer, desperate need to survive. It no longer mattered. All that mattered was the next step. Late in the afternoon, as the shadows grew long and purple, the nature of the terrain began to change. The narrow, claustrophobic canyon walls gave way to a wider valley. The ground softened, and patches of resilient, sun-bleached grass appeared between the rocks. The air itself seemed to change, losing some of its baked, sterile quality and taking on the faint, sweet scent of distant cottonwoods and damp earth. Silas finally stopped at the crest of a low rise. He stood for a long moment, not resting, but surveying the land below. Ellie came to a halt beside him, her chest heaving, and followed his gaze. Spread out before them was a small, hidden valley, a bowl of relative green cupped in the hands of the surrounding red rock mesas. A thin creek, lined with a handful of tenacious trees, cut a meandering path through its center, and there, tucked against the base of the far cliff face as if seeking its protection, was a homestead. It was not a grand place. The cabin was built of rough-hewn logs, weathered to a silver gray, with a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. A small, haphazardly fenced corral stood nearby, empty save for a single, sturdy-looking horse that raised its head at their approach. A lean-to was attached to the side of the cabin, sheltering a stack of firewood and a collection of worn tools. The whole place had an air of being forgotten by the world, of having hunkered down to endure rather than to prosper. It was dilapidated, isolated and stark, and to Ellie, after days of running, it looked like the safest place on earth. As they drew closer, the cabin door creaked open. A small figure emerged, shielding his eyes against the setting sun. It was a boy, no more than 6 years old, with a shock of untidy brown hair and a smudged face. He was barefoot, wearing a simple shirt and trousers that were a little too big for him. When he saw Silas, his face broke into a wide, unreserved grin. "Silas!" he yelled, his voice a piping treble that seemed startlingly loud in the profound silence. He ran toward them, his small feet kicking up puffs of dust. He didn't launch himself at Silas, as another child might have. He stopped a few feet away, his grin unwavering, his eyes bright with pure, uncomplicated joy. Silas, in turn, did not smile, but the hard lines around his mouth seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. He reached out and placed a large, dusty hand on the boy's head, a gesture that was both a greeting and a blessing. "Tom," was all Silas said. The boy, Tom, then noticed Ellie, who was standing back, hesitant and unsure. His grin vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed, solemn curiosity. He looked from her torn dress and scratched face to Silas, a silent question in his eyes. Silas gave no explanation. He simply walked past the boy toward the cabin. Inside, supper. Tom stayed where he was for another moment, studying Ellie with the frank, unnerving stare of a child. She felt a flush of shame, suddenly aware of her own filth and disarray. She was an intruder here, a piece of broken debris washed up on the shores of their quiet life. She clutched her small satchel to her chest, the only familiar thing she had left. Tom seemed to come to some sort of decision. He gave her a small, shy nod, then turned and scampered after Silas into the cabin. Ellie hesitated at the threshold. To step inside felt like a final surrender, an acceptance of a fate she still didn't understand. But the thought of staying outside, with the vast, empty darkness of the desert night about to fall, was unbearable. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she crossed it. The inside of the cabin was one room, clean but sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and 2 cots were built into the far wall, covered with wool blankets. There were no decorations, no softness, save for a small, crudely carved wooden horse that sat on the mantelpiece. It was a space built for function, not comfort. Silas was already at the hearth, adding wood to the embers from a large pot that hung over them. Tom was at a pump in the corner, working the handle with great concentration until water gushed into a tin basin. He carried it carefully to the table. No one spoke to her. No one told her what to do. She stood awkwardly by the door, feeling large and out of place. After a moment, Silas straightened up from the fire and looked at her. He didn't speak, but his gaze flickered from her face to the basin of water on the table, and then to a clean, folded piece of cloth that lay beside it. It was a silent invitation. Cautiously, she approached the table. The water was cool and clear. She dipped the cloth into it and began to wash the grime and dried blood from her face and hands. The simple act felt like a baptism, a washing away of the train, the chase, the terror. When she was done, Silas took a bowl from a shelf, ladled a thick, savory-smelling stew into it, and placed it on the table in front of her. He did the same for Tom, and then for himself. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against earthenware and the crackle of the fire. The stew was simple jerky, beans, wild onions, but to Ellie, it was the most magnificent meal she had ever tasted. It was hot and filling, and with every spoonful, she felt a measure of strength returning to her exhausted body. She watched them, her eyes darting between the man and the boy. Silas ate with the same quiet efficiency he did everything else. Tom, on the other hand, kicked his feet against his chair legs and occasionally glanced at her over the rim of his bowl, his curiosity still not entirely satisfied. There was an easy, unspoken understanding between them. A look from Silas was enough to still the boy's fidgeting. A small gesture from Tom was immediately understood and answered. This was a home, a broken, lonely sort of home, but a home nonetheless. And the presence of the boy changed everything. Men who were truly evil did not raise children with such gentle, unspoken care. It didn't mean Silas was a good man, not necessarily, but it meant he was capable of goodness. And for now, that was a sliver of hope she could cling to. When they were finished, Silas took the bowls to the basin. Tom, without being asked, climbed onto one of the cots, pulled a blanket over himself, and was asleep within minutes. Silas gestured for Ellie to take the other cot. She hesitated, her mind still racing. Trust did not come easily, but her body was making decisions her mind could not. She was so tired she could barely stand. She lay down on the cot, fully clothed, and pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin. Silas did not go to bed. He checked the bar on the door, extinguished the main lamp, and then sat in one of the chairs by the fire, the dying embers casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She watched him through slitted eyelids. He sat perfectly still, a rifle resting across his knees, a silent guardian in the dark. The last thing she saw before sleep finally claimed her was his unmoving silhouette, a mountain of a man standing watch over his tiny, broken valley. The next few days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. No one asked her name. No one asked where she came from or why she was running. Her existence was simply accepted, like a stray cat that had wandered in and decided to stay. This absence of questions was the greatest kindness she could have been shown. It allowed her the space to simply be, to let the raw, frayed edges of her nerves begin to heal without the pressure of having to explain her wounds. The small kindnesses continued, always silent, always practical. Every morning, she would find the water bucket by the door filled with fresh, cool water from the creek. A piece of soap appeared on the washstand. When her dress, torn and filthy from the escape, became unbearable, she found a simple, mended shirt and a pair of boys' trousers, outgrown by Tom, folded neatly at the foot of her cot. They were too large, but they were clean and whole. Silas would leave for hours at a time, riding out into the surrounding mesas, checking trap lines or hunting. He would return as silently as he left, a brace of rabbits or a bird slung over his saddle. He never announced his departures or his arrivals. She would simply look up, and he would be there. In his absence, she had Tom. The boy's initial shyness quickly wore off, replaced by a constant stream of chatter. He followed her as she swept the cabin floor or tried to mend her dress. telling her about the lizard he'd seen, the hawk that circled overhead, the way Silas had taught him to make the carving of the horse on the mantle. He never asked about her past, only accepting her presence in his present. His innocent company was a balm, a reminder that a world existed beyond fear and flight. One afternoon, seeking a moment alone, Ellie found a spot behind the cabin where the sun fell in a warm, protected patch against the log wall. She sat down, leaning back, and closed her eyes, letting the heat sink into her bones. It was the same sun that had tried to kill her in the desert, but here, in this quiet place, it felt different. It was a comfort, a gentle warmth that eased the lingering aches in her body. She sat there for a long time, not thinking, just feeling. She felt the solid wall at her back, the warm earth beneath her, the gentle breeze on her face, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she noticed her own breathing. It was slow and even. The frantic, shallow gasps of the chase were gone. The tight, constricted breathing of constant fear had eased. Here, in this forgotten valley, under the silent watch of a man she did not know, Ellie was finally beginning to breathe again. The healing began not in her mind, but in her hands. For days, Ellie had existed in a state of suspended animation, a guest who ate when fed and slept when exhaustion claimed her. But a body that has known only work cannot remain idle for long, and a spirit that has been hunted cannot truly rest until it reclaims some small piece of its world. It began with the broom. It was a simple thing, handmade from a branch and stiff grasses, leaning in a corner of the cabin. One morning, while Silas was out and Tom was chasing a lizard near the creek, she picked it up. The handle was worn smooth from use, fitting into her palms with a familiar weight. She started at the door, sweeping the packed earth floor with short, methodical strokes. The rhythmic scrape and whisk was a grounding sound, a sound of order, with every motion. She was not just clearing away dust, she was pushing back the chaos, asserting a tiny dominion over the small space that was sheltering her. Her hands, which had been scraped and raw, began to feel useful again. They were not just for holding a satchel or clinging to a moving train. They were for doing, for making, for mending. When Silas returned, he stopped at the threshold, his gaze taking in the neatly swept floor. He said nothing. He simply removed his dusty boots, a thing she had never seen him do before, and set them carefully by the door before walking inside in his stockinged feet. The gesture was louder than a page of spoken words. It was acknowledgement. It was respect for the work she had done. After the broom came the water basin. She took their bowls after the evening meal and washed them at the stand, the warm, soapy water a comfort to her skin. She mended a tear in one of Tom's shirts with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box, her stitches small and even. She learned the subtle rhythms of the homestead. She learned that Silas rose before the sun. The first sound of the day, the quiet scrape of him honing his knife or checking his rifle. She learned that Tom was always hungry, a small vessel of endless energy and chatter that provided a constant, cheerful noise in the vast quiet. She began to take on the small tasks of their life, fitting into the spaces between the man and the boy. She did not ask permission. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. She gathered eggs from the 3 scrawny chickens that scratched a living in the dust behind the cabin. She pulled the stubborn weeds that threatened the small patch of herbs growing by the creek. Her body, once a source of only pain and fear, became an instrument of purpose. The aches from her flight were replaced by the satisfying soreness of a day's labor. She felt her own strength returning, a quiet, steady tide rising within her. And all of this happened in a world of profound silence. Silas still rarely spoke, but the nature of their silence had changed. Before, on the train and in the canyons, it had been the silence of strangers, a void filled with uncertainty and potential threat. Now, it was a language all its own. It was a language of shared space and quiet understanding. When he would come in from the heat, she would have already drawn a fresh bucket of water from the creek, leaving the dipper floating on top. He would drink deeply, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the cup in a silent "Thank you." When she struggled to lift a heavy log for the fire, his hand would suddenly appear beside hers, taking the weight without a word, the two of them carrying it inside together. One evening, he was sitting at the table, cleaning his pistol with a concentration that seemed to block out the rest of the world. The pieces were laid out on an oiled cloth in a precise, metallic pattern. Ellie was on the floor by the hearth, showing Tom how to braid blades of grass into a long, green rope. The boy's laughter was a bright, happy sound in the cabin. Silas paused in his work, his hands stilling. He wasn't looking at the gun. He was watching them, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He watched her patient hands guiding the boy's clumsy fingers. He watched the genuine, gentle smile that touched her lips as Tom finally succeeded. It was a look of pure observation, a long, quiet appraisal. In that moment, Ellie felt she was being seen not as a burden, not as a woman, not as a victim, but simply as a person. Then, just as quickly, his attention returned to the gun, and the moment was over. But it left an echo behind, a sense of having been understood. The silence between them was no longer an empty space, but a vessel. It held the things they did not need to say. "I am grateful. You are safe here. I see you." Trust was being built not with promises or declarations, but with the steady, quiet accumulation of small, decent acts. One day, she wandered farther from the cabin than she ever had before, following the thin trickle of the creek as it wound its way toward the base of the cliffs. The landscape was harsh, a world of stone and sun-baked earth. Life here was a struggle. The trees were gnarled, their roots clinging desperately to the rocky soil. The grass was tough and sparse. It was a place of survival, not of softness. And then she saw it, growing from a crack in a large, flat boulder. A place where no living thing should have been able to find purchase, was a single, tiny flower. It was a shock of defiant color in the sea of brown and gray. Its petals were the deep, vibrant purple of a twilight sky, and its stem was thin but wiry, holding its bloom up to the sun. It was small, fragile, and utterly beautiful. Ellie knelt, tracing the outline of a petal with the tip of her finger. It felt like a miracle, a testament to the fact that life could find a way, that beauty could exist, even in the harshest of places, in its stubborn resilience. She saw a reflection of her own burgeoning hope. Carefully, she plucked it from the rock, its stem making a tiny, crisp sound. She held it in her palm on the walk back to the cabin. It seemed too precious a thing to hide. When she reached the small porch, she didn't know what to do with it. To give it to Silas directly felt too forward, a breach of their silent contract. To put it in water felt like claiming it for herself. Instead, she laid it on the worn, sun-bleached railing of the porch, right next to the door. Its purple head was a spot of impossible color against the gray wood. It was an offering not to him, but to the homestead itself. A small, silent gesture of thanks, a quiet contribution of beauty. She went inside, her heart beating a little faster than usual, and busied herself with preparing the evening meal. When Silas returned, he saw it. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he paused on the porch. He looked at the flower for a long moment, his head tilted slightly. He didn't touch it. He didn't acknowledge it in any way. He simply entered the cabin, sat at the table, and waited for his supper as he always did. A knot of disappointment tightened in Ellie's chest. He hadn't understood, or perhaps he simply hadn't cared. It was a foolish, childish gesture, she told herself, a silly weed. In a man's world of guns and survival, what use was a flower? The meal was eaten in the usual quiet, but for the first time in weeks, the silence felt empty again. Later that night, long after Tom was asleep, Ellie lay on her cot, feigning sleep. A storm was brewing in the high desert, and the wind had picked up, rattling the wooden shutter and whistling a low, mournful tune through the cracks in the logs. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, casting a warm, dim light through the room. Silas was not in his bed. He was sitting at the table, his back to her, by the low light of the embers. She could see he was holding something in his hands. It wasn't his gun or his knife. It was a small, square object bound in dark, cracked leather, a journal or a ledger, its pages yellowed with age. He sat there for a very long time, just looking at it. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached over and picked up the little wildflower from where he must have brought it inside and placed it. In the dim light, it looked almost black. He opened the book to a page near the middle. Using his thumb, he carefully held the page down and, with his other hand, he laid the flower flat against the paper. He took his time, arranging the delicate petals, smoothing them down. Then, with an almost reverent gentleness, he closed the book, pressing the flower between its pages. He held the closed book in his large hands for another moment before tying the leather thong that held it shut and placing it back inside a small wooden chest at his feet. Ellie lay perfectly still in the darkness, her eyes wide open. She didn't dare to breathe. He hadn't dismissed her gift. He hadn't ignored it. He had preserved it. He had taken her small, fragile offering of beauty and placed it among what pages held his own history, his own memories. He had made it a part of his world. No words had been spoken. No grand declarations had been made, but lying there, in the deep quiet of the cabin, with the sound of the wind outside, Ellie knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that a seed of trust, as small and as stubborn as a wildflower growing from solid rock, had finally taken root. The days settled into a comfortable groove, a quiet pattern of chores and shared silences that felt more like home than any place Ellie had ever known. The sharp edges of her fear had been worn smooth by the steady, predictable rhythm of life in the valley. She knew the way the morning sun first struck the highest mesa, the sound of Tom's bare feet on the cabin floor, the exact creak of the water pump. These small certainties were the foundation upon which she was rebuilding her world. One evening, the air was unusually still and heavy, carrying the scent of distant rain. Tom was already asleep on his cot, his small chest rising and falling in the deep, untroubled rhythm of childhood. Ellie was at the wash basin, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, washing the 3 earthenware bowls from their supper. Silas sat at the table a few feet away, the light from the single lantern casting a golden glow on his hands as he worked. He was mending a piece of harness, his movements economical and precise, the sharp, clean scent of leather polish mingling with the wood smoke from the hearth. It was a scene of profound domestic peace, and it was this very peace, this fragile sense of safety, that allowed the ghosts of her past to finally step out of the shadows. The scrape of her cloth against the rough pottery was a lulling, repetitive sound. Her hands moved automatically, a task she had performed 1,000 times in another life. And as her hands worked, her mind drifted. The warmth of the water, the dim light, the quiet man mending leather. It all conspired to lower her defenses. A memory, unbidden and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through the calm. It was a memory of another kitchen, a place of cold drafts and the constant, sour smell of stale beer and fear. Her hands stilled in the water. The rhythmic scrubbing stopped. Silas did not look up, but she felt his focus shift. The subtle change in the tension in the room was as palpable as a drop in temperature. His hands, too, had paused in their work. Ellie stared down into the murky water, but she wasn't seeing her own reflection. She was seeing her father's face, flushed and bloated, his eyes holding the desperate, shifty look of a man who had gambled away everything, including himself. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the silence. He used to say a daughter was a curse, Silas's hands remained motionless over the piece of leather. He did not ask who he was. He didn't need to. He simply waited, a silent, unmovable rock in the turbulent waters of her memory. The words began to spill out, a slow, painful trickle at first, then a steadier flow, as if a dam inside her had finally broken. My mother died when I was small. After that, he started drinking, and after the drinking came the cards. He wasn't good at it, but he loved it. He loved the hope of it. I think the hope that one hand could fix everything. She began washing the bowls again, her movements now jerky and agitated, sloshing water over the sides of the basin. He sold everything. My mother's locket, the good chairs, the horse, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left to sell. Nothing but me. She stopped, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the basin. She could feel Silas's gaze on her now, steady and unwavering. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of intense, focused listening. He was giving her the courtesy of his full, silent attention. There was a man in town, she continued, her voice dropping lower, taking on a brittle, fragile quality. Mr. Gable. He owned the saloon. He was old, and he coughed all the time, a wet, rattling sound. He had these soft, pale hands, and he used to watch me when I came into town for supplies. He watched me in a way that made my skin feel dirty. She took a ragged breath, the memory of physical weight in her chest. My father lost a lot of money to him, more than he could ever pay. So they made a deal. His debts would be cleared, and Mr. Gable would get a new wife. The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Even the crickets outside seemed to have fallen silent. Tom murmured in his sleep, a small, innocent sound that was a stark contrast to the ugliness of the words that now hung in the air. They celebrated, Ellie whispered, a bitter twist to her lips. My father came home that night with a bottle of whiskey, happier than I'd seen him in years. He said my fortune was made. He said I would be the wife of an important man. He didn't seem to see the way Mr. Gable's eyes crawled over me. Or maybe he saw, and he just didn't care. She finally looked up from the basin, her gaze meeting Silas's across the small space. His face was a mask of shadows, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were dark and still, absorbing her pain without judgment. The wedding was to be in 2 days. The night before, Mr. Gable came to our house. He brought me a dress. It was shiny, the color of a cheap coin. He told my father he wanted to ensure his investment was sound. He wanted to make sure I was untouched. The word hung there, obscene and clinical. Ellie's gaze dropped back to her hands, which were trembling in the water. My father, he just nodded and left the room. He went out to the porch to finish his bottle, and Mr. Gable, he just stood there, smiling at me. He started to unbutton his waistcoat. Her voice broke on the last words. She could not continue. She could not describe the blind, animal panic that had seized her, the way the room had seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and unbreathable, the feeling of being trapped, a fly in a spider's web. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to finish. The truth had to be told. All of it. I never did anything with that man, she whispered, the words so faint they were barely more than breath. I told him I felt faint, that I needed water. When he turned his back to get it, I ran. I grabbed the little bag I had packed weeks before, hoping for a chance like this. I ran out the back and I didn't stop running until I saw the lights of the train. She looked at Silas again, her eyes pleading for, she wasn't sure what. Understanding absolution. I ran away before that night, she said, her voice now a raw, aching whisper. I'm still intact. She said the word as if it were a confession of guilt, a terrible secret. In the world she came from, that status was a commodity, a thing to be owned and sold. It was the reason she had been a prize, and the reason she had been hunted. To her, It felt not like a mark of purity, but like a brand, the source of all her trouble, a dangerous liability she carried within her. It was a wound. Having finally spoken the entirety of her shame, she felt utterly hollowed out, exposed and vulnerable. She waited for his reaction, a question, a word of pity, a grunt of disgust, anything. Silas did not respond. He simply sat there in the heavy silence, the lantern light carving deep lines into his face. For a full minute, he did not move. Ellie's heart sank. His silence was a wall. He had heard her story and found nothing to say. Perhaps he thought her foolish. Perhaps he now saw her as nothing but trouble, a magnet for the kind of men who had followed her onto his train. Then, slowly, he picked up his tools. With the same deliberate precision as before, he continued his work on the harness, pulling a stitch tight, then another. The spell was broken. The confession was over. He had retreated back into his world of silence. A cold wave of despair washed over Ellie. She had offered him the broken pieces of her past, and he had left them lying on the floor. She turned back to the basin. Her shoulders slumped and finished washing the last bowl with numb, clumsy fingers. She dried her hands, walked to her cot, and lay down, facing the wall, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. She was a fool to have thought he might understand. He was just a man, like any other. She lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the pop and hiss of the dying fire, the steady breathing of the sleeping boy, the whisper of the wind outside. She heard Silas put away his tools, the soft thud of leather and the click of metal. She heard the scrape of his chair as he stood. She tensed, waiting for him to go to his own cot. But he didn't. She heard his soft, stockinged footsteps move first to the door. There was the familiar, heavy sound of the thick wooden bar being dropped into its iron brackets, but it wasn't followed by the usual silence. She heard him push against the door, testing the bar's hold. He did it twice, a quiet, firm pressure. Satisfied, he moved away. His footsteps went to the single window. She heard the soft thud of the wooden shutter being closed, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the faint orange glow from the hearth. Then came another sound, a soft scraping. He was wedging a small piece of wood into the gap between the shutter and the frame, making it impossible to pry open from the outside. He wasn't done. He began to walk the perimeter of the room, his steps slow and measured. He was a sentinel pacing his post. She could hear him running his hand along the log walls, pausing occasionally. He was checking the chinking, the mud and straw mixture that sealed the gaps between the logs, ensuring there were no weaknesses, no places an eye could peer through or a blade could be slipped. It was a ritual of fortification. It was not the panicked action of a frightened man. It was the careful, methodical work of a man who understood violence, who knew the 100 small ways a predator could gain entry. He was treating the cabin not as a home, but as a fortress. Ellie lay frozen on her cot, her back to him, but every sense was alive, tracking his movements in the dark. A slow, dawning realization began to spread through her, a warmth that pushed back the cold despair. He had heard her story not as a tale of shame, but as a report of a clear and present danger. He had heard the description of Mr. Gable, of Barlow and Jed, and he had translated it into the only language he truly trusted, the language of action. His silence had not been a rejection. It had been an assessment of the threat. And this silent, meticulous securing of every door, every window, every crack, this was his response. He wasn't offering empty words of comfort. He was offering walls. He was offering steel. He was offering his vigilance. He was protecting her. Not her purity, not her value as a woman, but her Ellie. Her right to sleep through the night without fear. Her fragile, newfound peace. When he was finally satisfied, he moved to his own cot. She heard the rustle of his blanket as he lay down. The cabin was now a sealed, protected space, and in the deep, secure darkness. For the first time since she was a little girl, Ellie felt completely and utterly safe. She understood, in a way that needed no words at all, that he was protecting her with his body and with his silence. And in that moment, that was more than enough. The peace of the valley was a fragile thing, a thin pane of glass against the stone of the outside world. For weeks, that glass had held. The sun rose and set. Tom's laughter filled the air, and the silence between Ellie and Silas became a comfortable, shared language. The fear that had been Ellie's constant companion had receded, becoming a dull, distant ache instead of a sharp, ever-present pain. The day it shattered began like any other. The afternoon sun was a heavy, golden blanket thrown over the homestead. Tom was near the corral, trying to coax the lone horse to eat a handful of grass. Ellie was on the small porch, mending one of Silas's shirts, her stitches slow and careful. The needle moving in and out of the rough fabric was a soothing, domestic rhythm. Inside the cabin, Silas was cleaning his rifle, the methodical scrape and click of the cleaning rod a familiar, reassuring sound. The first sign of trouble was the horse. It suddenly threw its head up, ears twitching, and gave a low, nervous snort, its eyes fixed on the narrow mouth of the valley. Tom, startled, dropped his grass and took a step back. From inside, the metallic sounds of the rifle cleaning stopped. A moment later, Silas was at the door. His eyes narrowed, his body taut with an immediate, animal alertness. He looked not at the horse, but past it, to the place that had captured its attention. Ellie followed his gaze, her heart giving a sudden, painful lurch. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, 3 figures on horseback resolved themselves out of the shimmering heat haze. They were still distant, but they were moving with a grim, undeniable purpose. Even from afar, she recognized the shape of them, the cruel set of their shoulders. Barlow, Jed, and Pike. "Tom," Silas's voice was low and calm, but it held a new and terrible urgency. "Get inside, now!" The boy didn't hesitate. He ran for the cabin, his small face pale with confusion and nascent fear. Ellie scrambled to her feet, the shirt and needle forgotten, her hands suddenly cold and clammy. Silas pushed them both inside and threw the heavy bar across the door, the thud echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. "Stay away from the window," he ordered, grabbing his rifle from the table. He moved to the small gap in the wooden shutter, peering out. The sound of the approaching horses grew louder, a thudding, rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. They stopped just outside the cabin. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the creak of saddle leather. Then Barlow's voice cut through the air, cold and laced with a mocking satisfaction. "Silas Boone, heard tell you'd hold up out here. Didn't figure you for a man who'd steal another man's property." Silas said nothing. He remained at the shutter, the long barrel of his rifle resting on the sill, a silent, deadly promise. "We know she's in there. Boone," Barlow continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The girl, send her out, and we'll ride away. This ain't your fight." Ellie held her breath, her back pressed against the far wall, Tom hiding behind her skirts, his small hands clutching the fabric of her trousers. She looked at Silas's rigid back, at the unyielding line of his shoulders. She knew he would not send her out. The thought was a small, fierce spark of warmth in the ice of her terror. "Last chance," Barlow called. The response was the deafening crack of Silas's rifle. It wasn't aimed at them. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust 10 feet to the left of Barlow's horse. A single, unambiguous word of defiance. The explosion that followed was the sound of Jed's shotgun blasting a hole in the cabin door. Splinters flew into the room before the echo had faded. A heavy boot slammed against the weakened wood. The door shuddered, the bar groaning in its brackets. Another kick, and another. The wood around the iron brackets began to splinter and crack. Silas moved away from the window. pulling Ellie and Tom toward the back of the cabin. "Stay down," he grunted, his face a mask of grim determination. With a final, shattering crack, the bar gave way and the door flew open, torn from one of its hinges. The three men filled the doorway, their faces shadowed and menacing. What happened next was a blur of brutal, chaotic violence. Silas didn't wait for them. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a force of nature unleashed. He met Pike in the doorway, and the butt of his rifle came down in a vicious arc, striking the man on the side of the head. Pike crumpled to the ground without a sound, but it was 3 against 1. As Silas turned, Jed was on him, a big man fueled by rage. They grappled, 2 powerful bodies crashing against the table, sending bowls and utensils scattering across the floor. Barlow, ever the strategist, circled around them, a long-bladed knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. Ellie could only watch in frozen horror, Tom sobbing quietly behind her. It was a primal, desperate fight. The sounds were guttural and ugly, the thud of fists on flesh, ragged gasps for air, the scrape of boots on the floorboards. Silas fought like a cornered bear, all muscle and ferocious will. He threw Jed off him, sending the big man staggering back, and landed a solid punch that snapped Barlow's head to the side. For a wild, hopeful moment, it seemed he might win, but the odds were too great. As Silas turned to face Jed again, Barlow recovered and lunged, not with his knife, but with the heavy butt of his pistol. He brought it down hard on the side of Silas's head. There was a dull, sickening thud. Silas grunted, his knees buckling. He staggered, tried to stay upright, but his strength was gone. He collapsed to the floor, a long, bloody gash opening on his temple, and lay still. The world stopped. Silence descended on the cabin, broken only by Tom's terrified whimpers. Ellie stared at Silas's unmoving form, at the blood beginning to pool on the dusty floor. A profound, hollow coldness spread through her, a despair so complete it felt like death itself. "Well," Barlow said, breathing heavily as he straightened his vest, "that was more trouble than it was worth." He nudged Silas with the toe of his boot, but there was no response. Jed, his face bruised and his lips split, glared down at Silas with pure hatred before his eyes found Ellie. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He started toward her. It was never about him. "Girl," Barlow said calmly, wiping a smear of blood from his pistol. "Always about you, mister. Gable is a patient man, but his patience has run out." Panic, blind and absolute, seized Ellie. She started to back away, pulling Tom with her, but there was nowhere to go. The wall was at her back. Then Jed did something that changed everything. He lunged forward, not for Ellie, but for the boy. He grabbed Tom, yanking him out from behind her, and clamped a thick arm around the child's small chest. He pulled a knife and held the flat of the blade against Tom's throat. "You make a sound. You even breathe wrong," Jed snarled, his face inches from Ellie's, "and the boy pays for it." Tom let out a choked, terrified cry. The sight of the steel against the child's soft skin, the look of pure terror in his eyes, broke through Ellie's paralysis. The cold despair in her veins ignited into a white-hot fury. It wasn't a thought. It was an instinct, a primal, protective rage that overwhelmed all fear. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, for anything, and then she saw it. Hanging on 2 wooden pegs over the stone mantelpiece was Silas's other gun, a heavy double-barreled shotgun. She moved. Barlow and Jed were focused on her terror, not expecting a reaction. She took 3 quick steps to the fireplace, her hands reaching up. The shotgun was heavy, heavier than she could have imagined. Its wooden stock was cold and alien in her trembling hands. She fumbled with it, nearly dropping it, before she managed to pull it down from the pegs. Barlow laughed, a short, ugly sound. "What are you going to do with that, girl? You don't even know which end the shot comes out of." She didn't know. He was right. Her arms shook under the weight of the gun. The long, twin barrels wavered, pointing at the floor, then the ceiling. But she lifted it. She braced the stock against her hip, her knuckles white. She looked past the barrels, down at the man holding a knife to a little boy's throat. "Let him go," she said. Her voice was a reedy, trembling thing, but it held a core of new, unbending steel. "You will not take him," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "You will not break this place." Just as Jed opened his mouth to reply, a new sound split the air. It was a rifle shot, sharp and loud, but it came from outside. A bullet tore through the roof of the porch, sending a shower of wooden splinters down. "Barlow, get out here," a voice yelled from the direction of the barn. It was a gravelly, older voice. "You're surrounded by armed men. Drop your weapons." Barlow and Jed both spun toward the door, their faces a mask of confusion. There was only one man who could be in the barn: Raul, the old hired hand who came by once a week to help Silas with the heavier work, who must have arrived to find a war zone. It was a lie, a desperate bluff, but in the chaos, it was enough. For one critical second, their attention was diverted. Jed's head turned toward the sound, his grip on Tom loosening fractionally. It was the only chance she would get. Ellie didn't aim. She simply pointed the heavy barrels in Jed's direction and pulled one of the triggers. The shotgun roared, a deafening concussive blast that filled the small cabin with thunder and black smoke. The recoil was a brutal, physical blow, a mule kick that slammed her back against the stone of the fireplace and sent her tumbling to the floor. The gun clattered from her numb fingers. Through the ringing in her ears and the acrid, choking smoke, she saw Jed scream. He staggered back, dropping his knife, his hand clutching his shoulder as a dark stain spread across his shirt. He hadn't been killed, but the blast had torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder, shattering his confidence and his hold on Tom. The boy, freed, scrambled away, running to where Silas lay still and silent on the floor. Barlow stared at the blood on Jed's shoulder, then at Ellie, who was pushing herself up from the floor, her eyes blazing with a ferocity he had never imagined. He looked at the smoking barrel of the shotgun, and then toward the barn, where another rifle shot could come at any second. They were no longer hunters cornering a frightened doe. The tables had turned. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He grabbed the dazed Pike, hauling him to his feet, and pushed the groaning Jed toward the door. They stumbled out of the cabin and scrambled onto their horses, riding away not with the swagger of victors, but with the panicked haste of defeated men. The thunder of their retreat faded, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than the one that had come before. It was a silence filled with the smell of gunpowder, the sight of the broken door, and the reality of Silas's still form on the floor. Ellie knelt in the middle of the wrecked room, her body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline and terror. She looked at her hands. They were shaking, but they were the hands that had held a shotgun, that had pulled a trigger, that had defended a child and a home. The homestead was broken. The man she had come to care for was bleeding on the floor, but for the first time in her life, Eleanor Vance was not. She was standing. The echo of the shotgun blast faded, replaced by a ringing silence that was heavy and thick with the aftermath of violence. For a moment, no one moved. The cabin was a tableau of wreckage, the splintered door hanging askew, the overturned table, the still bleeding form of Silas Boone on the floor. Then Raul was there, the old hired hand, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and his back bent from a lifetime of hard labor, appeared in the ruined doorway, a long hunting rifle held loosely in his weathered hands. His bluff had worked. He took in the scene with one sweeping, practiced glance, the smoking shotgun on the floor, the terrified boy huddled over Silas, the girl standing frozen in the middle of it all. His gaze lingered for a second on Ellie, a flicker of surprise and respect in his pale blue eyes, before he moved to kneel beside Silas. The alive Raoul's voice was like gravel in a dry creek bed. The question broke Ellie's trance. She scrambled forward, dropping to her knees on the other side of Silas. His face was ashen beneath the dust and blood. The gash on his temple was deep and ugly, still weeping a slow, dark river of red into his hair. But when she pressed her trembling fingers to the side of his neck, she felt it a pulse, faint and thready, but there. "Yes," she breathed, the word a prayer of thanks. "He's alive." "Tom," Raoul said, his voice softening as he looked at the boy, who was crying silently, his small hands resting on Silas's chest as if he could will him to wake. "Go fetch the clean rags from the chest, and the small bottle of carbolic. Go on now, son. We need your help." The boy, given a task, a purpose, scrambled to obey. Raoul's calm, steady presence was an anchor in the chaos. Together, he and Ellie managed to gently lift Silas, his body a dead weight, and carry him to his cot. They laid him down, and the world seemed to shrink, its new center this small bed in the corner of the ruined cabin. What followed was a descent into a timeless, twilight world where the only markers were the rising and setting of the sun, noticed only as a shifting of the light through the broken door. The valley, the mountains, the entire world outside ceased to exist. Their universe was now the size of one room, its air thick with the scent of herbs, blood, and fear. Raoul, a man of surprising gentleness for one so gnarled, cleaned the wound with a practiced hand. Ellie brought him water and held the lamp, her hands shaking so badly the light danced across the walls. Tom stood by, a silent, white-faced sentry, handing them rags as needed. "It's a bad one," Raoul muttered. "His work done, the skull ain't cracked. I don't think, but the devil knocked hard on his door. Nothing to do now but wait for him to send the devil away." Raoul stayed for 2 days, his presence a quiet comfort. He fixed the door as best he could. Nailing a spare plank over the shotgun hole, he cooked a thin, nourishing broth on the fire, his movements slow and methodical. He spoke little, but his quiet work was a message: life goes on. The world still turns. You must endure. On the 3rd morning, he laid a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "I gotta get back to my own place," he said. "I'll be back in a few days. Keep him warm. Try and get some of this broth into him if you can. And watch the boy." He looked over at Tom, who was sitting on a stool by the cot, his gaze fixed on Silas's still face. This man is all he's got. Then he was gone, and the silence that descended was heavier than before. It was just the 3 of them now, a silent, sleeping man, a frightened little boy, and a girl who had become, by necessity, their keeper. Ellie's life became a ritual of care, a vigil measured in heartbeats. She did not leave his side. She slept in the chair beside his cot, waking at the slightest change in his breathing. She kept the fire going, the warmth a bulwark against the cold shadow that seemed to be hovering over him. Every few hours, she would bathe his face with a cool, damp cloth, wiping away the feverish sweat that beaded on his brow. She spoke to him in a low, constant murmur, telling him about the sun coming up, about the hawk she saw circling the valley, about Tom's latest drawing. She didn't know if he could hear her, but the sound of her own voice kept the terror at bay. It was a promise to the stillness that they were still there, still fighting. Getting the broth into him was the hardest part. She would lift his head with one hand, the dead weight of it a terrifying reminder of his helplessness. With a spoon, she would dribble the warm liquid onto his lips, praying he would swallow. Sometimes a little would go down. Most times it would just run down his chin, and she would have to wipe it away, her heart sinking with each failed attempt. During this time, she saw him in a way she never had before. She saw the network of old, faded scars that crisscrossed his back and arms when she changed his shirt, thin white lines that spoke of knives, and puckered, rounder scars that spoke of bullets. This was not a man who had lived a peaceful life. He had walked through the same kind of violence that had crashed into their valley, and he had survived. The thought gave her a sliver of hope to cling to. He was a survivor. He just had to do it one more time. Tom was her silent partner in the vigil. The boy's playful chatter was gone, replaced by a solemn, watchful quiet. He barely ate. He spent his hours sitting on the floor by the cot, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing on a piece of smooth, light-colored wood. He drew Silas on his horse, tall and strong. He drew the three of them sitting by the fire, their home whole again. They were pictures of a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away, a world he was trying to bring back into existence through sheer force of will. One afternoon, he brought her his drawing. It was a picture of her, standing over Silas with a shotgun in her hands, and 3 dark figures running away. In the drawing, she was a giant, a fierce protector. Ellie felt a lump form in her throat. She pulled the boy into a hug, his small, bony body trembling against hers. They were all each other had, 3 broken people clinging to each other in the wreckage. The days bled into one another. Ellie grew thin, her face pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She moved like a phantom through the cabin, her thoughts consumed by a single, desperate prayer. "Please wake up. Please don't leave us." She had run to this man for shelter, but she had come to rely on him for something more. His quiet strength had been the rock on which she had begun to build a new life. Without him, the foundation would crumble, and she and Tom would be cast adrift in this harsh, unforgiving world. She began to read to him. She found the small, leather-bound book she had seen him with that night. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It wasn't a journal. It was a book of poems, the pages soft and worn with handling. In the front, a single name was written in faded ink, Eleanor, the same as her own. It was a strange, shocking coincidence. She found the page where he had pressed the wildflower. It was still there, a fragile, purple memory. She started to read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet room. The words were about mountains and rivers, about love and loss, about endurance. They were words of beauty and pain, and as she read them, she felt she was giving him the only medicine she possessed, a balm of words for his wounded spirit. On the evening of the 4th day, the fever broke. His skin, which had been hot and dry, grew cool and damp. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened into a more natural rhythm. Ellie felt a surge of hope so powerful it made her dizzy. He was fighting. He was coming back. That night, a storm rolled in, the wind howling around the cabin and the rain lashing against the roof. Tom was asleep, exhausted, curled up at the foot of Silas's cot. The fire had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. Ellie sat in her chair, her head resting on her arms on the edge of the mattress, her own exhaustion a heavy, leaden weight. She must have dozed off. She wasn't sure what woke her. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, the feeling of being watched. She lifted her head, her neck stiff, her mind still foggy with sleep. She blinked, trying to focus in the dim light, and then she saw it. His eyes were open. They weren't unfocused or hazy. They were clear, the color of a stormy sky, and they were looking directly at her. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She just stared back, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was awake. He was looking at her. A great shuddering sob escaped her, a sound of profound, overwhelming relief. The tension she had carried for days, the fear that had been her constant companion, finally broke. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unchecked. She didn't try to wipe them away. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. It was more than a statement. It was a question, a plea, a confirmation of a miracle. "You didn't die. You didn't leave us alone." His lips, dry and cracked, moved. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. He swallowed, a painful, difficult motion. He tried again. His voice was a mere ghost of its former self. a faint, raspy whisper. But the words were clear in the profound quiet of the room. Still here. It was an echo of her own words, a promise kept. A smile broke through her tears, a wobbly, watery thing. But it was the most genuine smile of her entire life. She reached out and laid her hand on his skin still cool but no longer deathly cold. His fingers twitched, a faint but deliberate movement, a response to her touch. In that one shared glance, in those two whispered phrases, everything changed. The last wall between them, the one built of silence and uncertainty, crumbled into dust. He was no longer just the silent cowboy who had hidden her under his coat. She was no longer just the terrified girl he had rescued. He had fought for her life, and she, in turn, had fought for his. They were bound together now by something deeper than gratitude or obligation. They were no longer strangers. The world returned to Silas Boone one piece at a time. The first piece was the low, steady murmur of Ellie's voice, reading words he couldn't quite grasp, but that felt like a cool hand on a fevered brow. The second was the savory scent of Raoul's broth, a smell that anchored him to the world of the living. The third, and most important, was the feeling of Tom's small, warm hand clutching his, a silent, desperate plea for him to stay. His recovery was a slow, arduous climb out of a deep, dark canyon. The first day he managed to sit up, the room swam violently, and the effort left him drenched in a cold sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But Ellie was there, her arm a steady, surprisingly strong support at his back. A cup of water held to his lips. She didn't fuss or flutter. She simply provided what he needed, her presence a quiet, unshakable certainty. The days that followed were measured in small, hard-won victories. The first time he stood, leaning heavily on the wall, his legs trembling like a newborn foal's. The first time he walked the few steps from his cot to the table, an epic journey that left him utterly spent. The first time he sat on the porch, blinking in the bright sunlight, the fresh air a balm to his battered body. Through it all, Ellie was his shadow, his silent keeper. She never crowded him, never offered pity. Instead, she anticipated his needs with an intuition that was both startling and deeply comforting. A stool would appear for his feet just as his legs began to ache. A cup of cool water would be on the table beside him just as his throat grew dry. She seemed to know what he needed before he did, moving with a quiet efficiency that asked for nothing in return. As Silas's strength slowly returned, so did the life of the homestead. The heavy, fearful silence that had blanketed the cabin during his convalescence began to lift. Tom, seeing that Silas was not going to leave him, rediscovered his voice, his childish chatter and laughter, which had been absent for so long, returned like the birds after a long winter, filling the quiet spaces with life and joy. He would follow Silas on his slow, shuffling walks around the corral, a small, constant companion, recounting his adventures with lizards and his plans to build a fort by the creek. Life settled into a new rhythm, a dance of three people in a small, isolated world. It was a life built not on words, but on actions, on 1,000 small, unspoken gestures of care that, woven together, created a bond stronger than any vow. Ellie would be at the clothesline, hanging their washed things in the bright desert sun, and she would look up to see Silas watching her from the porch, his gaze steady and thoughtful, before he would turn his attention back to carving a small piece of wood. A few days later, a beautifully carved, tiny horse, a perfect miniature of the one on the mantel, would appear on Tom's cot, a silent gift that was meant for the boy, but was also, in its own way, for her. Silas began to take on the work of the homestead again, his movements slow and careful at first, then growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. He started with the fences, shattered in the brief, violent raid. Ellie would bring him a jar of water and leave it on a fence post in the shade. She wouldn't interrupt him, wouldn't speak, But when he reached for it, his work-roughened hand closing around the cool glass, he would look over at the cabin, where she was sweeping the porch or tending her small herb garden, and their eyes would meet across the dusty space. In that shared glance, a volume was spoken. "I am here. I see you. I am grateful." There were no declarations, no flowery speeches of affection. Love, in this harsh and unforgiving land, was a practical thing. It was in the way she always saved him the best piece of meat from the stew, placing it in his bowl without comment. It was in the way he noticed her shoes were worn through and, one evening, sat by the fire with a piece of scrap leather and an awl, patiently crafting a new, sturdy soul for her. It was in the way he always positioned himself between her and the mouth of the valley when they were outside, his body a silent, protective shield. Their conversations remained sparse, but they were no longer necessary. They had learned to read the subtle language of each other's presence. The set of his shoulders told her if he was tired. The small, quiet hum she made when she was content told him she felt safe. They moved around each other in the small cabin with an easy, unthinking grace, a familiarity that spoke of a deep and settled connection. The silence was no longer an absence of words, but a presence in itself, a shared space of peace and understanding. The summer deepened. The days grew long and hot, the sun beating down on the red rocks until the air itself seemed to shimmer. The nights were a mercy, cool and clear, the sky a vast canopy of brilliant, glittering stars. The valley was an oasis of life, the creek running steadily, the cottonwoods providing a deep, welcome shade. It was a time of healing, for the land and for the people within it. The scars on Silas's head faded, disappearing into his hairline, and the deeper scars within Ellie, the ones carved by fear and loneliness, began to fade as well. One evening, the sun was setting in a blaze of glory, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange, purple, and gold. The light flooded the valley, bathing the small homestead in a warm, ethereal glow. Ellie was standing by the corral, her hands resting on the top rail, watching the horse nuzzle Tom's outstretched hand. Silas was a few feet away, leaning against a fence post, his long day of work done. He had been mending the corral gate, and the clean, sharp scent of freshly cut wood hung in the air. The beauty of the moment was so profound, so peaceful. It made Ellie's heart ache. She looked at this small, perfect world they had built or had found together. The laughing boy, the quiet, steady man, the deep and profound safety of this hidden place. Everything she had ever wanted, everything she had never dared to hope for, was right here, in this golden light. She turned to look at Silas. He was watching her, his face softened by the twilight, his stormy eyes holding a quiet, unreadable expression. In that moment, the need to speak, to give voice to the overwhelming gratitude and love that filled her, was more powerful than any fear or hesitation. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, barely more than a whisper on the still evening air, but it was clear and steady. "The first time I saw you, I was so afraid," she began, her gaze holding his. "All I wanted was to disappear. When I asked to hide under your coat, I was just a frightened animal looking for a dark place to hide from the hunters." She paused, taking a breath, the words coming from a place deep within her soul. "I don't want to hide anymore." "Silas," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the force of her emotion. Now all I want is to be able to stand beside you out in the sun, in the rain for the rest of my life." It was everything, a confession, a declaration, a proposal. She had laid her heart bare, offering him the entirety of her past, her present, and her future in those few, simple words. She stood before him, vulnerable and open, her life held in her hands as an offering. The silence that followed was immense. The world seemed to hold its breath. A cricket began to chirp, its small song the only sound in the universe. Silas did not speak. His expression did not change. He simply pushed himself off the fence post and took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing every line, every feature. She held his gaze, her heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment that would define the rest of her life. He said nothing. Slowly, with a deliberate, almost reverent grace, he lifted his right hand. He did not reach for her. Instead, he brought his hand to the front of his own worn, cotton shirt. His fingers, calloused and sure, went to the top button, a small, polished piece of bone just below his throat. He paused for a heartbeat, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, he undid the button. He moved to the second one, his fingers working with the same unhurried, meaningful slowness. It was not a gesture of passion, not a prelude to a physical act. It was something far deeper, far more profound. It was a ritual, it was a reply. With every button he unfastened, he was speaking to her in the only language he truly knew. He was peeling back the layers of his own silence, his own defenses. He was unbarring the door to his heart, a place far more fortified and protected than the cabin had ever been. He was not offering her his body. He was offering her his very self. He was showing her the scars she had tended, the heart she had healed, the soul she had touched with her quiet strength and gentle spirit. He undid the last button and pulled the sides of his shirt open. The golden sunset light fell upon his chest, upon the old scars and the strong, steady beat of his heart. He was not asking her to hide under his coat anymore. He was inviting her in. The golden light of the setting sun bathed them, a silent witness to the profound and sacred moment passing between them. The air was still, holding the scent of dust, dry grass, and the faint, clean smell of freshly worked wood. Silas stood before her, his shirt open, his chest bared not in a display of pride or possession, but in an act of complete and utter vulnerability. It was a testament, a silent offering of every scar, every hardship, every battle that had shaped the man who stood before her. Ellie felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. This moment was too clear, too precious to be blurred. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, she lifted her hand. It trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the sheer weight of the emotion that filled her. She had asked to stand beside him, and in response, he had invited her into the very heart of his being. Her fingers, hesitant at first, came to rest on his chest. The skin was warm from the last of the sun, taut with the muscle beneath. It was the chest of a man who had known a lifetime of hard labor and harder fights. Her touch was featherlight, a question, a reverence. She was not exploring a man's body. She was reading the history of a life. Her fingertips traced the faint, silvery line of an old scar that ran diagonally across his collarbone, a whisper from a long-forgotten conflict. She felt the slight, puckered indentation of another, older wound on his shoulder. These were the marks of the life he had lived before her, the silent stories he never told but carried with him always. Then, her hand moved to the newest scar, the one that was still a tender, puckered line of healing flesh along his ribs where one of Jed's wild blows had connected. This scar was different. This one was hers. It was a part of their shared story, a physical mark of the moment he had stood between her and the brutal world. She pressed her palm flat against it, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her hand. It was the rhythm of safety, the sound of home. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. In their stormy depths, she saw no passion, no desire, but something far more profound, a quiet, unwavering tenderness that seemed to see straight into her soul. "Does it still hurt?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a long moment, he did not answer. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding a universe of unspoken feeling. When he finally spoke, His voice was a low, rough murmur, softer than she had ever heard it. "Not as much as watching you be afraid." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow, but it was a blow that healed, not harmed. With that one simple sentence, he swept away the last lingering shadows of her past. He told her that her fear was a greater wound to him than any knife or bullet. He told her that her well-being, her peace, was more important to him than his own body. He told her, without ever saying the word, that he loved her. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. He lifted his other hand and, with a gentleness she could scarcely believe from a hand so large and calloused, he brushed it away with the pad of his thumb. He did not pull her closer. He did not kiss her. He simply stood there, letting her see him, letting her touch his wounds, and in doing so, he healed hers. That night, the cabin was filled with a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the comfortable silence of companions. It was a hallowed, peaceful quiet, the kind that settles over a place that has become sacred ground. Tom slept soundly on his cot, the world of adults a distant, peaceful murmur. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of soft, glowing embers, casting a warm, gentle light on the two figures who lay on Silas's cot. They lay side by side, on top of the rough wool blanket, their clothes still on. There was a space between them, a respectful distance, but the air in that space was charged with a profound and gentle intimacy. The world outside, with its dangers and its cruelties, felt a universe away. The broken door had been mended, the shutters were barred, and inside this small, fortified space, a new world had been born. Ellie turned onto her side, facing him, in the dim, red glow of the embers. She could just make out the strong lines of his profile, the silhouette of his broad shoulders. He was looking at the ceiling, his hands laced behind his head. He had given her his answer on the porch, an answer spoken in deeds, not words. Now, he was giving her something just as precious, the space to come to him, to make her own choice, free from pressure or expectation. And she chose. She moved across the small space between them, a quiet rustle of cloth in the stillness. She laid her head upon his chest. She felt the muscles there tense for a fraction of a second in surprise, and then relax, accepting her weight, welcoming her. His arm, which had been behind his head, came down, settling around her shoulders, holding her not with a lover's passion, but with a protector's strength. It was the same arm that had held the coat over her on the train, the same arm that had pulled her from the path of a bullet. Now, it was her haven. She closed her eyes, and her world became the simple, profound sensations of this moment. The rough texture of his shirt beneath her cheek, the clean, familiar scent of him, pine, leather, and wood smoke, and beneath it all, the sound that had become her anthem of survival, the sound that had anchored her in the darkest of times, the slow, steady, powerful beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of life, the sound of strength, the sound of steadfastness. Lying there, held securely in the circle of his arm, Ellie finally understood. All her life, she had been defined by what she was to other people. To her father, she was a commodity, a debt to be paid, to Mr. Gable and his men. She was property to be claimed. She had believed, in the deepest part of her being, that her only value, her only worth, lay in the simple, biological fact of her innocence. It was a thing to be protected, a thing to be traded, a thing to be stolen. But Silas had never asked for it. He had never cared about it. He had fought for her right to breathe free, for her right not to be afraid. He had looked past the frightened girl and had seen the survivor. He had seen the woman who could calm a child, who could make a home out of a desolate cabin, who could find beauty in a single wildflower, who could stand her ground with a shotgun in her hands. He loved her not for the part of her that was untouched, but for the part of her that had endured. He loved her for who she was. A deep, profound peace settled over her. A peace so complete it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. She was not a prize to be won or a possession to be owned. She was Ellie, and she was loved. The silent beat of the heart beneath her ear was a vow, a promise, a quiet proposal that had already been accepted. Here, in the heart of the unforgiving West, in the arms of a silent, scarred man, she had finally found her sanctuary. The seasons in the high desert turned with a slow, deliberate grace, each one leaving its mark on the small, hidden valley. The fierce heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, defiant yellow, their leaves rustling in the cool breeze like 1,000 tiny voices whispering secrets of endurance. Life on the homestead settled into a rhythm as natural and steady as the changing seasons. The shattered door had long been mended, the new wood already beginning to weather and blend in with the old. The scars of the attack had faded, both on the cabin and on its inhabitants, replaced by the routines of a life being built, day by quiet day. Their world was small, a self-contained universe bounded by the red rock mesas that stood like silent, benevolent giants guarding their peace. It was not a perfect world. The roof over the porch still sagged in one corner. The corral fence was a patchwork of old and new wood, and the dust was a constant, tireless adversary. But it was a world that was whole. It was a world that was theirs. A typical afternoon would find the valley humming with the quiet sounds of life. Tom, his childish solemnity having blossomed back into boisterous joy, would be out in the sun-drenched meadow, his laughter as bright and cheerful as a sparrow's song as he chased grasshoppers through the tall, dry grass. Raoul, who now came by twice a week, a permanent fixture in their small family, could be found by the creek, his gnarled hands patiently mending a leaky section of the water trough, his low, gravelly humming a constant, comforting presence. Inside the cabin, the air would be warm and fragrant with the scent of baking bread. Ellie moved about the small space with a newfound grace, her motions fluid and sure. The hunted look that had once lived in her eyes had been replaced by a calm, clear-eyed serenity. Her hands, once scraped and trembling, were now dusted with flour, skilled in the arts of kneading dough, stitching seams, and tending to the small hurts of a growing boy. She was no longer just a survivor. She was the heart of their home, and Silas was its guardian. His strength had returned fully, the deep wound to his head now just a faint, silvery line hidden in his hair. He was in constant motion, his energy channeled into the endless work of the homestead. Today, he was on the porch roof, the rhythmic, solid tap of his hammer echoing through the valley as he secured a loose shingle. He moved with a quiet, powerful economy, a man completely at home in his world, his presence a silent promise of safety and stability. This was their life, a tapestry woven from the simplest of threads, the smell of baking bread, the sound of a boy's laughter, the steady tap of a hammer, the shared, comfortable silence of a man and a woman who had found in each other a sanctuary from the storm. When the bread was done, a perfect, golden brown loaf, Ellie cut a thick, warm slice from the end. She spread a thin layer of butter on it, watching as it melted into the steaming, soft crumb. She placed it on a small plate, poured a cup of cool water from the bucket, and carried them out to the porch. "Silas," she called up, her voice soft. The hammering stopped. A moment later, his head and shoulders appeared at the edge of the roof. He looked down at her, his face beaded with sweat, a smudge of dust on his cheek. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, softened when they met hers. "Come down for a minute," she said, a smile in her voice. "Rest." He didn't argue. He swung himself down with an easy grace. Landing softly on the porch boards, he took the cup of water she offered, drinking deeply, his throat working. He ran the back of his hand across his mouth and looked at the slice of bread. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He took the plate and sat on the top step of the porch, his back against a post. Ellie sat beside him, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, eating the bread and watching Tom chase a butterfly in the distance. The sun was beginning its slow descent, its light turning thick and golden, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The moment was so simple, so profoundly peaceful, that it felt like a dream. She thought back to another simple moment, one filled not with peace, but with terror the moment she had first spoken to him, a desperate whisper in a dark, rumbling boxcar. The memory no longer held any fear. It was simply the beginning of the story, the first shaky step on a long and winding path that had led her here, to this sun-warmed porch, beside this man. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar, comforting gesture. He didn't tense, he settled, his body accepting hers as a natural extension of his own. "That day on the train," she began, her voice a soft murmur, almost a thought spoken aloud. "When I whispered to you, when I told you about myself." He turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on the top of her hair. He waited. "I only told you that I was untouched. You didn't ask anything. You didn't say a word." She paused, reliving the moment not with shame, but with a sense of wonder. "You just stood up and started to unbutton your shirt." She felt the slight movement of his chest as he took a breath. He was silent for a long moment, not a cold or distant silence, but a thoughtful one, as if he were choosing his words with great care. He lifted his hand, the one not holding the plate, and gently stroked her hair, his fingers tucking a loose strand behind her ear. "Because I didn't need you to give me anything," he said, his voice so low she felt it more than heard it. "Only your trust." The words settled over her, simple and profound. They were the final key, the one that unlocked the last, stubborn door in her heart. He hadn't seen her as a treasure to be guarded or a prize to be won. He hadn't seen what the world had tried to make her. He had seen a human being in need of a safe harbor. Her innocence had been the world's currency, the reason for her flight and her fear. But to him, it had been irrelevant. All he had asked for, all he had ever wanted, was her trust. And in earning it, he had given her a freedom she had never known was possible. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him, her heart in her eyes. He had finished the bread. He set the empty plate aside and took her hand, his large, calloused fingers lacing through hers, a perfect, familiar fit. They stood up together and walked to the edge of the porch, their clasped hands a silent testament to the bond between them. They looked out over their small, imperfect, and utterly complete world. Tom was now lying on his back in the grass, pointing out shapes in the few fluffy clouds that drifted across the vast, blue sky. Raoul was packing up his tools, his work for the day done. The horse in the corral gave a low, contented nicker. This was their life, a life not free from scars, but defined by healing. A life built on a foundation of quiet actions and unspoken truths. Here, the heavy bar on the door was no longer a defense against the world, but simply a piece of wood and iron. The true lock, the unbreakable seal on their home, was the trust they held in their hands. They stood there, hand in hand, as the golden light deepened and the first cool breezes of evening began to stir. The world outside the valley, with its cruelty and its chaos, still existed, but it could no longer touch them. It could no longer make them tremble. They were anchored here, together, in a love that needed no words, in a home that needed no locks. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow listeners. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more people, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.